Our second scripture today is from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 1 to 8. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume, but Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and the money given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." This is a really hard passage. It's got so much stuff going on. It feels, first off, and obviously, as if it contradicts much of what we know about Jesus. It is culturally inappropriate. It is hard to make sense of. It's one of those passages that, as a pastor, when it comes around in the lectionary, I read it every year and I go, "Oh, man." And yet, at the same time, it's a passage, the story is told by all four of the gospel writers in slightly different ways, but it's there in all four of them. So we know that all four of the gospel writers thought this was an important story to hear and to wrestle with. It is extravagant and wasteful. Here, Mary pours what we're told is a pound of pure nard, costly perfume, onto Jesus' feet. Now, I didn't know what nard was until this past week. If I'd known it in the past, I'd forgotten it. It's actually an endangered species that grows only in the foothills of the Himalayas. So it's no wonder it was as expensive as it was. And expensive it was. We're told Judas says, "Why didn't we sell this for 300 denarii? That's approximately a year's income for an average person in that day and age. If we just translate that, I don't know what the average income is right now, but even if we just put it at minimum wage, it's still pretty darn close to $25,000. That's a lot of money poured onto Jesus' feet. Think of how many bags of groceries that would buy for the Unity shop, or meals, or beds at the mission. How many showers through Showers of Blessings. How much building materials that would buy for Habitat for Humanity. How many other charities could use an extra $25,000 to do significant work in the community? It's no wonder the disciples are upset. And in the other stories, it's not just Judas who complains. It was scandalous that that amount of resources gets poured onto Jesus' feet and into the floor when they were surrounded by such need. After all, Bethany translates as poor town. They were on the other side of the tracks, surrounded by poverty, and yet they spill this onto the floor. Even if Judas was planning to skim some for himself, whatever would have been left over still could have made a difference in someone's life. Each drop of ointment, just a drop, would have fed a needy child, clothed someone without adequate clothing, provided shelter for one of their neighbors without a home. And the story goes on, and it becomes even more scandalous than that. The other three Gospels don't identify the woman as Mary, the sister of Lazarus, but one of them goes so far as to imply that the woman was a prostitute. After all, how else would she have had that amount of resources saved up there in the midst of poor town? And she does this sensual and provocative thing, wiping the feet of Jesus with her hair. Something she could have done in other ways. She could have used a towel. She could have even used the hem of her dress, but instead she does something that no Israelite woman would ever have done in public with a man. It's no wonder that at least one of the gospel writers sees her as being a prostitute. Who else would do something like this? Who else? This past week or so, we've been hearing about the inappropriate touchiness of Joe Biden. He had nothing on Mary. Nothing at all. If the complaints about him are a tempest in the teapot, this was a hurricane. Of course, the disciples question. It flies in the face of everything sensible and proper. It is needlessly sensual and provocative in this Middle Eastern culture, and it ignores the obvious and real needs all around them. And then it gets worse than that. Jesus accepts the actions and seems even to justify them with that crazy statement, well, you always have the poor with you, but you don't always have me. What in the world does he mean by that? How many times have we heard someone say, we don't have to take care of the poor because Jesus even said they're always going to be around. It's kind of like mosquitoes. There's nothing you can do to get rid of them, so you just put up with it and swat them when you have to. I would say quickly, I don't think that's what Jesus was meaning here with this. He wasn't removing responsibility for working to change the system. But that doesn't make it any easier, does it? We still are faced with the question of what in the world do we do with this passage? And we know the struggle that people have with how we use our resources as people of faith. How many times have we heard, oh, well, churches, if they sold a half of their property and used it to do something really good, then the whole world would be a better place. We hear that. I hear that. So what's going on here? How can we make sense of it? And I'm going to try. You can decide whether I did it or not. This Mary is the same Mary who sat at Jesus' feet. And he treated her as a whole and serious person, equal to a man. Something that didn't happen in that time and place very often. She found that he affirmed in her the gifts that she had, even those gifts that were outside of typical expectations for that culture. When Martha comes and complains, Jesus, make her help me, Jesus says, no, she's chosen the good part. She's sitting here and she's learning. She's learning. And I imagine as Martha grumbled back into the kitchen to clean the dishes, she was saying to herself, well, she ought to be doing this instead. This is the same Mary who cried out to Jesus in grief after her brother died, and in more than grief, because they lived in a time and place when women without a man were in very, very dire straits. And the only man they had in their lives was their brother Lazarus. When he died, everything was thrown up in the air, and the only possibilities were bad ones. So she cries to Jesus in grief at her loss of this one whom she loved, but also in fear of what this future can look like for me and my sister when there is no other way for us. And Jesus raises her brother from the dead. This is the same Mary who spent hours and hours with Jesus and found her life transformed, completely changed by the love and grace of God which she had experienced in and through Jesus. And so we see an extravagant response to extravagant grace. We see a scandalous response to scandalous grace. Indeed, we could even argue that we see a senseless response to senseless love. Mary has known the touch of Jesus, and she responds in a proportional way. It was wasteful, it was scandalous, but it was proportional to the experience of grace that Mary knew. Indeed, when Luke tells this same story, he reminds his audience that one's response to grace needs to be proportional to the grace received. The one who has received much gives much, he says. So what grace have you and I experienced in our lives? How have we experienced the touch of God? In good Baptist tradition, I was tempted to let this be a testimony time and ask folk to stand up and share their stories. But that won't translate well to YouTube, so instead I'm going to let you stew a bit and hold those things on your heart. So we're going to have just a couple of seconds of silence, and I'm going to erase it from the video on YouTube to reflect on the ways that we have felt the touch of God in our lives. Okay? Just a few moments of silence. Okay, if we can come back now. Hold that in your heart. Now, different churches do their offerings in different ways. Lots of churches don't take offerings anymore during their service. Sometimes you'll find a box or a basket back in the back of the church or up in the front of the church with the expectation that maybe someone will drop there. Many don't even do that. Many just expect that people are going to do their giving online. Or maybe give your credit card number to the church and have it automatically deducted every week. But there are still some traditions that take the offering time very seriously. And some churches in the African American tradition do a very dramatic kind of offering. When it comes that time in the service, they'll bring out a big basket and place it up here in the center, and the pastor will stand behind it, and often one of the deacons, and they will call the church to march forward. And it begins usually with the deaconesses, dressed in their white dresses, with their white gloves and their big church hats. And they will either march or sometimes dance down the aisle and put their offerings in the basket. And next come the tithers. And the tithers are obviously the ones who have committed themselves to tithing, and everybody knows who they are. And they will then march down the aisle, looking very proud of their commitment to that congregation, and they will place their offering in the basket and go back. And then the rest of the congregation comes down, and each does it. Now sometimes the pastor and the deacon will be watching, and they can see everything that goes in. And there are those Sundays when maybe it's the wrong time in the month, or maybe it was a sparse congregation that Sunday. But sometimes the pastor will say, now y'all have to listen up, because you know that God was with you this past week. And then maybe they'll point to Cheryl and they'll say, Cheryl, now you remember your son. He could have been arrested this week. He could have gotten himself in trouble. But instead, when he was tempted, the Spirit spoke to him and reminded him, no, don't go there. And so he didn't. And then he will point to someone else and he will say, now you remember it was 1 year ago that you had your cancer surgery. And then someone else, and he will point and say, you traveled to see your sister back in the and you found that God had touched her. Now, y'all need to come forward again. And so they all come forward again, and everybody places their offering in the basket. Again. And then the pastor will look in there again and maybe turn to the deacon and they'll whisper a little bit. Then they'll say, "Yo, now that's not adequate. Is that all that God has done for you this week?" And remind them again of the ways that God had touched their lives. Well, there is a story that this one Sunday, that is exactly what had happened. And it was time for the third parade down the aisle to place their offerings in the basket. And there was this young boy in the church. And he was a young boy. He didn't have any money. But he was part of the church, so he had marched up each time along with everybody else. And each of those prior 2 times he walked past the basket and he felt ashamed. He felt ashamed because he had no money to put in that basket. He didn't have a check that he could write. He didn't have anything in his pockets. He was just a boy. The third time he walked forward and he saw this big basket and he looked at it and he knew. He got in the basket. He got in the basket and sat down. He had no money. He had no particular skills that he could use to volunteer. He couldn't fix the electrical circuits or work on the plumbing. He couldn't run the lawnmower and cut the grass. He couldn't volunteer to fix food for Easter Sunday morning. So he got in the basket. And he gave God what he saw as a proportional response to the grace he had experienced. God had touched him. He gave his whole self. I imagine there were folk in that congregation who watched as this little boy climbed into the basket, who thought that was scandalous. It was ridiculous. What's this boy doing? Doesn't he know his shoes are dirty? What if he tears one of those big bills? Or when he gets those dirty shoes of his in there, it makes one of those checks unreadable, and then what will happen? What if it was my check? What if he smudges it a little bit and the bank gives more money than I meant? Where are his parents? Haven't they trained this child to know you don't do those kinds of things in church? This is dignified. This is proper. You don't get into the basket. That's just silly. But as he looked at his heart, he thought, this is the appropriate response for me. This is the proportional response. This is scandalous, it is senseless, maybe even a little embarrassing, but it is the proper thing for me to do in this time and place. And I don't care if it causes discomfort for anybody else. This is what I need to do. Our response to God's grace need not be extravagant like Mary's or as embarrassing as the boys. But our response to God's grace should be proportional, whatever that looks like for you. And it's going to be different for each one of us, and it's going to be different from week to week, month to month, year to year, time to time. It's going to be different because we experience God's grace in different ways, and the world around us presents itself to us in different ways. There very well may have been a day when Mary would have taken that jar of nard and started to break it, and Jesus said, No. We're going to sell that. We're going to sell that because that can provide food and shelter and showers. And we need to use it in that way today. There very well may have been that kind of time. But at that point in time, that was the appropriate response for Mary. And ours are going to change too. It's not always financial, but it may be. It may be time spent, or maybe it's something else. It may be talents shared. It may be simple as just being there with someone else when they need somebody there with them. Or it may be as complicated as fixing the electrical system at a church. But however we respond, this little story reminds us that it needs to be proportional to the grace that we have experienced. That's what I think this story tells us. That's why I think all four gospel writers wanted us to hear this story of this extravagant gift, this senseless gift, this scandalous gift, because it was proportional to the extravagant grace, to the senseless love, and the grace of God poured out into her life and into ours.